And if that's the case, then there has been much less time available for life to evolve on Earth. And the Darwinian mechanism, which requires billions of years to work, is looking far less probable. There are many methods of dating that have been suggested over the past 50 years or so which don't rely on radioactive techniques, and some of which suggest that the Earth could be younger than we customarily think. For example, meteoric dust comes into the atmosphere every year at quite a substantial rate. Now, if the Earth really were 4,500 million years old, there would be many billions and billions of tons of meteoric dust on the Earth's surface. And the dust, by the way, is very easy to identify because it has 300 times more nickel content than terrestrial dust does. But this dust isn't present. It's been suggested it's been swept into the oceans and incorporated into ocean sediments. But of course, the ocean sediments are available to us in the form of the sedimentary rocks that are exposed all over the Earth's crust. And there's no sign of the meteoric dust there either. So where's it gone? That's at least one measure which suggests the Earth could be younger than it presently is thought. The significance of the great age of the Earth is that Darwinism is essentially a theory that's about time. Darwinism requires billions of years of time because the way that evolution is envisaged by Darwinists is as a process of gradual change, tiny changes, one generation onto the next, taking place over billions of years. Without those billions of years, the Darwinian process just couldn't take place. Darwin's theory is, I think it's been accepted so well because it's an immensely powerful tool of explanation, and we humans love to have things explained. Of course, that's what science is all about, isn't it? Explaining the world to ourselves. Darwin's theory appears to explain how we got here, how all living things got here, how things change, how we all arose from a common ancestor, how the Earth itself came into being. And it's very satisfying to many people to believe that they have a natural explanation to all those questions. That, I think, has meant that to a large extent people have not questioned the theory quite as thoroughly as they should have done. They have not bothered to deal with the anomalies that have arisen in the evidence. And quite naturally, when anomalous evidence has been discovered, scientists have tended to put it to one side, to think, well, when our overarching theory is extended in future, it will ultimately be able to explain this. The trouble is that the anomalies have been building up. They haven't just been swept under the carpet. There's now a mountain of them, and the mountain is threatening to topple over and swamp the theory completely. The key problems with Darwin's theory are that, quite simply, there isn't any really solid empirical evidence. It's conjecture on conjecture, supposition on supposition. They're all very plausible, they're very rational suppositions, very rational conjectures, but they are still conjectures. And I find it ironic that for most of this century, Darwinists have acted and spoken as if they had already delivered conclusive proof to us of their theory. Well, in fact, that's the last thing they've done. There is no conclusive evidence of Darwinism. The evidence seems solid, but as soon as you start to investigate it, it just melts away. The idea is that the theory is basically in place, that there are just a few gaps, we'll fill those gaps in sooner or later. But when you come to examine the concrete examples that are given, that are taught in schools and colleges, that most people who've been educated in a developed country in recent years have been given and have accepted, you find that they're not quite what they seem. Let me give you a couple of examples. Probably the most famous example is the peppered moth. This is a light-coloured moth which lives in the northern counties of England, and between the years 1850 and 1900, when the trees were darkened by atmospheric pollution from factory chimneys, the moth changed from a light grey colour to a dark grey colour so that it could remain camouflaged on the tree trunks because the birds eat the moth. Well, this was described, this process, it's even been given a name by Darwinists. It's called industrial melanism, and it was described by the director of the Natural History Museum, Sir Gavin de Beer, as being an example of evolution and even natural selection taking place in man's lifetime. And obviously, if that were true, it would be very powerful evidence. Well, when you look at the peppered moth, you don't need to be a scientist to be able to see that what's happened is that originally you had a lot of light-coloured moths and a few dark-coloured moths, that the light-coloured moths have died off because the trees have turned dark, and that the dark-coloured moths have flourished at their expense. Now, if Darwinists want to call that natural selection, they're entitled to do so. But nobody could possibly believe that that is a mechanism that could explain how one species could turn into another species. And that is what evolution is all about, not about moths changing colour. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming completely aquatic in their way of life, and ending up looking like creatures, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. In other words, a bear, like a polar bear or a grizzly bear, could turn into a whale or a whale-like creature given only enough time, given millions of years and natural selection. Bears could become whales. Now, the interesting thing is that in later editions of his book, he removed this claim. He'd obviously thought about it, thought better of it, and realised that it couldn't be substantiated with evidence. Now, it's fine for an author to change his mind. All authors change their mind. But the significance of this is that the idea that a bear could turn into a whale is the central core idea of Darwin's theory. This is the whole of his theory. So when he removed that example, he was removing the very essence of his book, that one species could turn into another species by natural selection given enough time. Now, no Darwinist today would be rash enough to stand up and say that a bear could turn into a whale, but that is what they believe, or at any rate that's what they teach in schools and colleges. And the idea is unsupported by evidence today, just as it was in Darwin's day when he removed the example from his book. In the first edition of his book On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin made a very interesting observation. He said that he could see no difficulty in a race of bears taking to the water, becoming aquatic, and eventually becoming a creature, as he said, as monstrous as a whale. So there you have the idea, bears can turn into whales just given enough time and enough natural selection. Now, in later editions of his book, Darwin removed that claim. He'd obviously thought better of it and realised it couldn't be substantiated with evidence, so he thought he'd better not press it. But the interesting thing about him removing that is that the idea that a bear can turn into a whale through natural selection is the very core idea of Darwinism. It's the top and bottom of the Darwinian theory, that one species can turn into another species. And in removing that example, I can't help feeling that Darwin must have had grave reservations about the rest of his theory. An interesting question is, how did Darwin approach his own theory? How did he arrive at the theory? How did he publicise it? He was a very, very thorough researcher, and he considered many, many possibilities. He considered some ideas which are anathema to modern Darwinists. For example, he gave credence to the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. He wrote about a father who'd lost his fingers in an accident and had a son who also had missing fingers. So he was willing to entertain a range of ideas. But I can't help thinking that if Darwin were alive today and he saw what had been made of his theory, the modern neo-Darwinist theory, I think he would be horrified, because the modern theory is quite antithetical to this openness, to his willingness to consider every aspect of living things. The modern theory is a theory of blind chance and nothing more. On the face of it, Darwinism and creationism are opposite theories. They're diametrically opposed. In a funny kind of way, they actually can go together, because Darwinism itself only explains how one kind of creature turns into another kind of creature. It doesn't explain how life originated. Now, creationism is a theory that does explain how life originated. So I suppose you could say that for a person with religious beliefs, Darwinism and creationism could coexist. Darwinism, strictly speaking, doesn't offer an explanation of how life originated. That's a mystery. It's left unspoken. Darwin himself, in a private letter to a friend, conjectured that maybe there was a warm puddle somewhere on the Earth's surface, and that a few chemicals got together, and that spontaneously the first microorganism came into being. That's been a very popular idea for the last 100 years, but interestingly, no scientist has yet been able to actually synthesize anything from scratch, any kind of living being or any part of any living molecule. Nothing has been synthesized, despite a great deal of optimism on the part of microbiologists. So I think maybe Darwinism, Darwinists are conscious of the fact that there is a rather gaping gap in their theory right at the beginning. Creationists believe that the rocks of the Earth's crust demonstrate that the biblical tale of Genesis is correct, and that there was a global flood, that all the creatures on the Earth were destroyed in that flood, and that the sedimentary rocks and the fossils they contain are the relics of that flood. Now, I suppose you would have to say that, strictly speaking, you could interpret the fossils and the rocks in that way. The problem with the theory from my point of view is that there doesn't seem to be any evidence to support that view, just as there isn't any evidence to support the